The period since the mid-2010s has seen an increase in the number and power of far-right nationalist governments across the world, a trend that is correlated with a dramatic increase in anti-Semitism in the United States and Europe. Many Jewish musicians have released songs in response to these developments, often protesting injustice by analogy to the historical situation of Jewish radicalism in the early 20th century. One such musician is Canadian singer-songwriter Geoff Berner, whose 2019 album, Grand Hotel Cosmopolis, was intended to have, quote, the power to inspire bravery and defiance in the face of the growing threat of fascism across Europe and North America, end quote. Another is the American singer-songwriter Daniel Kahn, who, together with Zoe Korolenko, released the album The Fourth International in 2020. At its heart is the song Apocalyptic Prophecy, which imagines nuclear war and civil unrest engulfing the Middle East and Europe in an extrapolation of contemporary political movements. However, both these albums contain songs that leverage diasporic Jewish identity in order to imagine a utopian future in defiance of far-right nationalism. Berner's titular Grand Hotel Cosmopolis and Kahn's The Jew in You. In this paper, I will examine these utopian songs and their political messages and situate them in the context of both Jewish diasporism and the broader fields of diaspora studies and utopianism. Diaspora studies scholars have noted Jewish and other diasporic groups' ability to disrupt the norms of the nation-state, and I argue that Berner and Kahn seek to do just that through their music in order to resist the rise of chauvinistic nationalism. I will also examine how scholars have linked diasporism to utopianism and how Berner and Kahn's songs articulate this connection. Though both these songs are in English, their political stances are intrinsically related to Jeffrey Chandler's Yiddish-oriented notion of post-vernacularity, in that they raise Jewish language and identity as markers of difference and thus tools that can be used against the homogenizing forces of the far right. Vancouver-based singer-songwriter Geoff Berner has a long history as a leftist activist and as a musician in the local punk scene. Grand Hotel Cosmopolis, his eighth album, largely recontextualizes Jewish struggle from the early 20th century in response to contemporary crises. Most of the songs are either bleak or defiant, but the exception is the titular song Grand Hotel Cosmopolis, which is based on the real-life Grand Hotel Cosmopolis in Augsburg, Germany, which you can see here. It's a combination of art and social project that, quote, accommodates refugees, artists, musicians, and travelers under one and the same roof. Unlike in ordinary asylum seeker homes, this model provides an alternative solution of how refugees can be integrated into social life rather than live completely isolated from society, end quote. Berner describes a party at the hotel as a model for his ideal society. In the lyrics, Berner writes that, quote, if you're an exile like me, this is the place you can go. There's a lot of that going around, you know. Here's where the people are decent, friendly, and kind. That's a radical notion in these clarifying times, end quote. And then he exhorts the listener to go make a Grand Hotel Cosmopolis of your own. Though Berner's ideal society, as depicted in the song, is clearly a multi-ethnic and pluralist one, he describes it in a way that is strongly indebted to Jewish identity. Kahn, who was born in Detroit but has been based in Berlin since 2005, describes his music as Yiddish punk cabaret, and it has been strongly rooted in his Jewish heritage and leftist politics. The Fourth International is from a project with Russian singer-songwriter Zoe Korolenko called the International, which Kahn describes as less aggressive than his other music, but also as much more ironic. Much of the album adheres to the project's ironic sensibilities, but with some exceptions. The contrasting pair, Apocalyptic Prophecy and The Jew in You, are deeply earnest. The former imagines an apocalyptic scenario in which, quote, an atom bomb explodes like a divine curse in Jerusalem, leading to war throughout the Middle East, and America commits military perversions, and the whole world falls into chaos, end quote. The latter, The Jew in You, proposes universal diasporism as a remedy. Both these songs were drawn from Kahn's music for the 2010 play Warten auf Adam Spielmann by German-Turkish playwright Hakan Savaş Mikan, which is described as, quote, an apocalyptic absurdist dream play about a possible Jewish diasporic messiah from Detroit, end quote. And you can see a scene from that play here. In The Jew in You, Kahn invites the listener to embrace diasporic identity, to, quote, just climb aboard this ark of ours and join the soggy crew. It's a diasporic politics, it's a reconstructed you, and to bring out your Jew, end quote. Noting that it's more likely than not that you may have a Jew inside of you, some otherness that puts you at risk. He offers, quote, a way to hide away from what they would take away from you. Forget your God and country and your revolution too. It's possible to leave the many for the few, end quote. Given the earlier song's prediction of the destruction of the existing world order, The Jew in You proposes diasporic identity as a kind of portable homeland that enables one to cope with the hurts inflicted by chauvinistic nationalism. Complicating political interpretations of the song is Kahn's claim in a concert video that Apocalyptic Prophecy and The Jew in You are written from the point of view of the character of Adam Spielman, the possible messiah from Kahn's play, not from his own. However, Kahn's decision to release them on the Internationals album in 2020, and particularly his use of an expanded version of The Jew in You for the song's music video, still of which you can see here, shows that he remains engaged with the material and that it transcends its original context. Even if it was written about a highly specific fictional scenario, when I listen to The Jew in You today, I cannot help but imagine the refugees of wars caused by rising nationalistic sentiment around the world, as well as the coming millions of refugees from the effects of climate change. To quote Kahn, because the day will come when all your papers are refused, and then you'll find yourself in exile too, end quote. Both these songs engage with the emergent movement of Jewish diasporism, which is defined by Melanie K. Kantrovitz as an identity and practice rooted in Jewish anti-racism that, quote, embraces diaspora, offers a place we might join with others who value this history of dispersion, others who stand in opposition to nationalism and the nation state, end quote. K. Kantrovitz traces diasporism to the principle of Doigkeit, literally here-ness in Yiddish, as embraced by the General Jewish Labor Bund in Eastern Europe beginning in the late 1890s. She specifies that for diasporists, quote, Doigkeit means Jews enter coalitions wherever we are, across lines that might divide us, to work together for universal equality and justice, end quote. Both Berner and Kahn have clear links to the revival of Bundist political attitudes. Both have covered many Bundist songs, and Berner explicitly identifies himself as, quote, part of a leftist Jewish tradition that reaches back to the Yiddish Bund and beyond, end quote. In their songs, Berner and Kahn use diasporic Jews as representative of other groups who may suffer from the effects of chauvinistic nationalism, and emphasize Jewish otherness to build political bridges to these groups. A press release for Grand Hotel Cosmopolis states that Berner's goal is to, quote, use the leftist Jewish cultural tradition to inspire people to defend the human values of decency and the right of every human being to a life of safety and freedom, end quote. He embraces the traditional Soviet epithet of Jews as rootless cosmopolitans in order to emphasize Jews' solidarity with oppressed migrants. Likewise, much of The Jew in You consists of Kahn explaining his usage of Jewish identity as a shorthand for the kind of diasporism that he endorses. And I'll play a brief clip of Kahn here.
Well, my definition here could use some explanation. True, you have to ask yourself just what I mean when I say Jew. Well, the Jewishness concerning us should not be misconstrued. Blood and land are things with which it doesn't have to do. Religion is a matter most irrelevant here too. So let us try to look at this anew. To find a category underneath the ones we knew. A mercurial identity for people who are strewn in countries far and wide who haven't got home in view, who drag around like shackles all the roots from which they grew. Well, others have endured this illness too.
Kahn's association here of the condition of being in diaspora as inherently Jewish may seem to be somewhat exaggerated, but he does have a point. Until the 20th century, the very word diaspora was only used to describe the Jewish experience. Over the past century and a bit, however, Kahn reminds us that many other peoples have endured similar conditions, and the word diaspora now includes them as well. In the same way the word diaspora has its origin in describing the Jewish condition, many scholars associate Jews' minority status in early modern Europe as pivotal to the construction of the very idea of the nation-state. French scholar Richard Marion-Strass argues that the emancipation of the Jews in France in 1791 produced the model for all Western nation-states' treatment of the group identities of minorities for the next 150 years, as in either assimilate or go elsewhere. He points out that the Jews' existence as a recognizably distinct group was troubling to the model of the nation-state, since the very fact that they faced the choice to assimilate or not shows that belonging to a national group is a conscious choice, not a fact of nature. Because of this relationship to the state, Berner and Kahn's songs can be seen as calls for Jews and members of other groups to articulate their identities as distinct from the assumed default of the nations that they inhabit in order to counter chauvinistic nationalism. This conception of the powers of the diasporic condition is an early echo of early developments in the field of diaspora studies just after the end of the Cold War. In this era, Daniel and Jonathan Boyarin published their article, Diaspora, Generation in the Ground of Jewish Identity, in which they argue that the experiences of the diaspora have enabled Jews to embody an identity that is separate from territorial nationalism. And they propose diaspora as a theoretical and historical model to replace national self-determination. They define diaspora not as exile, but as, quote, sharing space with others, devoid of exclusivist and dominating power, where well-being is absolutely dependent on principles of respect for difference, end quote. James Clifford builds on the Boyarin's argument and writes that their account of diaspora aspires to be both, quote, a model of historical Jewish experience and a model for contemporary hybrid identities, end quote. While this scholarship was written in an era that the Boyarins refer to as one of the legitimation crisis of the nation state, I would argue that developments since that era, including the war on terror and the increasing right-wing authoritarianism worldwide, mean that the concept of the nation state is in many ways stronger than it has been in decades. But this, what the Boyarins call projective notion of diaspora, instead of being used as a resource in response to a historical crisis, is instead being used by Berner and Kahn to preemptively challenge nationalism at its strongest. In addition to the above arguments, Clifford notes diaspora's political ambivalence and its utopic-dystopic tension. He writes that diaspora consciousness lives loss and hope as a defining tension. The Boyarins also point out that diaspora is built on a paradoxical power. Quote, on the one hand, everything that defines us is compounded of all the questions of our ancestors. On the other hand, everything is permanently at risk, end quote. In other words, both the past and future are ambivalent for diasporic groups. The past is both desired, the inheritance of one's ancestors, and feared, the rupture that led to the diasporic condition. So too is the future desired, for why else remain a distinct group in diaspora if not for hope, and feared, the possibility of obliteration. This diasporic ambivalence is directly related to modern utopian theory. German philosopher Ernst Bloch embraced a philosophy that he called educated hope, which he located in the nexus of utopia and dystopia. Quote, not only hope's affect with its pendant fear, but even more so, hope's methodology with its pendant memory dwells in the region of the not yet, a place where entrance and above all final content are marked by an enduring indeterminacy, end quote. This indeterminacy, above all, leads to the recognition that things can be different than they are in the present. As Jose Munoz writes, who was also cited by Nick's presentation earlier, quote, this temporal calculus performed and utilized the past and the future as armaments to combat the devastating logic of the world of the here and now, a notion of nothing existing outside the sphere of the current moment, a version of reality that naturalizes cultural logic such as capitalism and heteronormativity, end quote. Of course, Berner and Kahn would add nationalism to this list of logics. Even though the future that Kahn imagines is murky and possibly filled with catastrophes, in the spirit of Bloch, the very mechanism of his future-oriented imagination enables the disruption of the status quo in such a way that may produce a utopia as unambiguous as Berner's. What role does Yiddish play in this diasporic conception of utopia? Jeffrey Chandler's concept of Yiddish post-vernacularity is particularly relevant here. He emphasizes that Yiddish, unlike the official languages of nation-states, is not, quote, thrust upon its speakers by any polity. Rather, those who use Yiddish do so voluntarily as communities, as families, and as individuals, end quote. Voluntary usage of Yiddish in this sense aligns with the Boyarins' conception of diaspora as an alternative to the totalizing logic of nation-states. Kahn and increasingly Berner have embraced this type of Yiddish usage in their music. Chandler also cites the queer Yiddishkeit movement, already active in the late 1990s and even more prominent today, as embracing Yiddish's status as a marker of otherness and using it to declare solidarity with other oppressed groups. In particular, he cites Alyssa Solomon's enumeration of parallels between queerness and Yiddishkeit, including, quote, a penchant for transgression, border crossing, and being proudly, defiantly different, standing as a challenge to broader society's sense of certitude and power, end quote. Speaking Yiddish is one way that Ashkenazi Jews can articulate their difference and help to transcend the status quo through what Claire Bergen refers to as an emergent temporality. They write that, quote, it is the ongoing daily prefigurative practice of Olam Haba, the world to come, in the tension between present and future, organized through ritual, enacted through relationship, that may endure in the future of Judaism on Turtle Island, end quote. Bergen's complex temporality of Olam Haba aligns with that of the diaspora as described by the Boyarins and others, as well as that of Utopia itself. Post-colonial scholar Bill Ashcroft asserts that, quote, in the displaced post-colonial world of diasporic subjectivity, is the constant horizon of the present, the horizon that is at the same time the horizon of the past, end quote. Past, present, and future intersect in the emergent temporality of utopia, which Bloch would argue is also the intersection of hope, fear, and perhaps most importantly, memory. Ashcroft writes that, quote, memory is that medium in which utopia can either dissolve into nostalgia or become the mode of transformation, end quote. The far right attempts to weaponize the cultural memory of the majorities in their nation states in order to reinforce that, as Isaac Deutscher writes, quote, their way of life and their way of thought have absolute and unchangeable validity, and all that contradicts their standards is somehow unnatural, inferior, or evil, end quote. Berner, Kahn, and other diasporists strike back by embracing cultural memory and identity that are contingent and challenge the natural authority of the state. In doing so, they look towards utopia. Thank you.